based on the experiences I started to have after he died. Because I started, as you know, from my book, because in my book, Till Death Don't Us Part, I talked about this as well. Suddenly, this was political journalist, this skeptic, this academic, and suddenly the furniture is starting to move in this scary house in the Chesapeake Bay.
Today's guest is Dr. Karen Frances McCarthy. She is a respected medium, scholar, and is author of Till Death Don't Us Part.
The first thing to get your head around, the first thing I had to get my head around was that something survives death. So consciousness, therefore, cannot be an emergent property of the brain. So it was the first.
Hi, welcome everyone. Today I am speaking with best-selling author, doctoral candidate, and award-holding spiritual medium, Karen Frances McCarthy. Welcome, Karen. It's great to have you on.
Oh, thanks. It's still great to be here, Elizabeth.
Thanks for coming. I have so many questions. I know we both were atheist materialists who ended up now thinking there is an afterlife, or I don't want to assume you think that, but it definitely sounds like you do. But tell us a little bit about your original career.
Well, I've had quite a colourful sort of history. So, I worked came originally from Dublin. Came out of college, worked in a circus for a while around New York City when I was a sort of a fresh graduate in my early 20s. Went to LA, worked in the movie industry for a while, and then came back and just packed all that in, went back to journalism school, the London School of Journalism, and moved into writing about politics, lifestyle and then politics. So I was in Iraq. I covered American politics for the Irish Times and a number of other different newspapers until 2010. In 2010, I was actually writing my first book, which was part of the Northern Ireland peace process. So in 2010, I was working on my first book, which is The Other Irish, which was part of the Northern Ireland peace process. It was a cultural outreach, so it was kind of backed by the government. It was sort of coming off the back of being a political journalist, and particularly in American politics. So it was about looking at how the people from Northern Ireland settled in the American South. So I was doing a lot of traveling around in the American South, doing research for this, and writing up the book. I was actually staying in a friend's house. I was house sitting for her in this big hulking house in the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. And I was actually staying in the attic, believe it or not. I mean, you couldn't write this stuff. I was a converted attic. It was quite nice. But when I got a phone call from New York to say that my fiance, who we had just sort of gotten engaged just before I left to head south, had just died very suddenly of a sudden massive heart attack in New York City one afternoon. And so I was down in Virginia working on that first book as part of the peace process when that happened. So finished that book, turned it in, never wrote about politics again after that. That was the last of it.
Then I know your whole story, and your book now really was, I'm sure, shocking in the best way and life-changing. So first of all, what did you think about an afterlife at the time of his passing?
So at that time, I'd been raised Catholic and had gone to, like most Irish Catholic, I went to a convent school. So I had been with the nuns from the time I was 4 until I was 17. And by the time I was 17, I'd had it. So I thought, that's it. I'm done. I told my mother I'm never going to Mass again. And I just bailed, and that was it. And I basically had no religious practice then for many, many years. And when I got into, about in my 30s at some point, I kind of just felt like there needs to be something. And I've written about this in my doctorate when I was doing my doctoral research, but just kind of felt like I need something else just besides this materialism. So I actually ended up finding my way into Zen, which suited me very well, because Zen is very non-theistic. There's very little ritual in it. It's not like Tibetan Buddhism. It doesn't sort of go in for things like reincarnation. It just doesn't take up these conversations. And so Zen really is more about being very present, embodying the teachings of the Buddha, but really was more about sort of like meditation and moving in life with compassion and loving kindness. And so that suited me because it just sort of helped bring a little sort of quality, calmness, and harmony really to my life. And so that I had been practicing for a number of years, quite a number of years. I don't know, 15 years when he died. But, Zen also at the same time, when you're faced with a situation like that, also didn't really provide the sort of answers I was looking for based on the experiences I started to have after he died. 'Cause I started, as you know, from my book, because in my book, Till Death Don't Us Part, I talked about this as well. Suddenly, this sort of political journalist, this skeptic, this academic, and and suddenly the furniture is starting to move in this scary house in the Chesapeake Bay. And it hadn't been a scary house before that. I mean, it was completely normal before that. And then suddenly the furniture's moving, like electronics are turning on, things are touching me, things are waking me up. All this sort of stuff is going on. And at that point, I'm just going, it's sort of looking like, where is the answer to this? And sort of the immediate answer was, well, it must be me losing my mind. I mean, where else do you go with that? But I didn't feel like I was losing my mind. It's perfect until. And so I was actually, it's one of those things that often happens to people where you arrive at a certain space or a certain time and um, sort of synchronicities start happening and you just start bumping into people you need to meet at certain times. And strangely enough, the first person whose little world I found my way into was the local Catholic priest, believe it or not, because I was out wandering the streets of this little town one evening. It was so hot, it was the summer. And I kind of got lost in this little town, and I kind of came to hearing the bell ring for mass, and there was this tiny little church in the middle of this town, and the evening mass was starting. Saturday evening mass was starting, and I was just sort of standing there looking at this big red door, and so I ended up going in and sat through the mass, and it was one of those masses where it was very, very low key. I didn't have all the flamboyance of mass we had in Catholic in Ireland, but it was just a very simple little church, and they had this beautiful singer. And it was like really sort of poetic because it had these stained glass windows, and because of the sun down in Virginia, the evening sun was pouring in through the glass. There was all these shafts of light, and there was this man singing this beautiful aria, and I just started crying, you know. And I think also there was an element of just the familiarity, even though I didn't subscribe and I wasn't practicing Catholic, there still was a familiarity to it, having grown up with it, and sort of was a little comforting in that way. And so afterwards, I decided I'll go into the rectory and ask the priest what he thinks, because I think I've gone mad, gone out of my mind with grief, right? And I thought, I'm going to go in, I'm going to interview this priest, going in with that hat on, and so I got myself all ready, and I went in ready to, and he opened the door, and he had such a kind face that I just burst into tears. And he ended up having to usher me into the rectory. Got his housekeeper, made me a cup of tea, and we sat there and had a conversation. And I told him all this weird stuff that was happening. And he was the first person to say to me, that's happened to so many of our parishioners. It's a sign from your loved one to let you know they're all right. And I just thought, from a Catholic priest, but it was such a beautiful thing. But a lot of parishioners had these inexplicable things happen. And it just happened that this priest, but the one in a million who was open to this idea, was the one I happened to meet in this tiny town where I didn't even know there was a Catholic, never mind a Catholic church, And so I went off after that, and of course I went to my default, which is let me research everything, let me read everything, let me try to find everything. So I came back and I was doing this research, and I read a statement by a cardinal from the Vatican saying that it is possible to communicate with our loved ones after we are gone, and also a quote from St. Dominic saying essentially, don't mourn for me after I am gone, because I can be more help to you then than I ever was in life, because the monks around him were grieving him on his deathbed. And so I was very surprised to find this within Catholicism, because even though I know Catholicism subscribes to the afterlife and all this sort of stuff. It's always been the Bible has always been so dead against this. I mean, we know from the Witch of Endor, we know from Deuteronomy, we know from Leviticus that never ever do this. And so it was very surprising for me to have this sort of level of openness from within the church. Now, what the cardinal was saying wasn't he wasn't condoning mediumship, but what they were saying was basically your own loved ones can make themselves known to you directly. And so that was a really interesting turnabout for me. And so it sort of started there, and I'm just a voracious reader. And so I was reading, my starting point after that was to start looking at some of the psychologists and the scientists that were talking about, because that was my first thing, was like, which, that can't answer these questions, but it was sort of where I went with it to start with, into the work of David Chalmers and Sam Parnia, and people were looking at these elements of consciousness, but also into, the sort of the new physics of, and it's not that physics can answer these questions or prove these questions. So we can't ever say, oh, quantum physics proves anything. It only can prove what it's designed to prove, but it can't do anything. It doesn't address consciousness. But what it did for me was it challenged these very hard and fast preconceived notions we have about the nature of reality. And that's where I was like, well, if all of this is going on, it doesn't speak to consciousness or the afterlife or anything like that. But what it does do is it does channel, or it does challenge, these things that we took as givens in the nature of reality. And so even just that made me go, well, maybe if we have to challenge that, let me see what else I can challenge. So that's kind of where I ended up following this round. And also I was in Virginia. And Virginia is this really little weird pocket in Virginia, which I've often called like the Area 51 of the afterlife, because the Virginia School of Perceptual Studies is there, the Monroe Institute is there, the Edgar Cayce International Headquarters are there. I found myself finding my way into a spiritualist church. I'd never even heard of spiritualism before this. Found my way into a spiritualist church. So all of that, I was sort of smack in the middle of that at that time, which is sort of interesting. So I was kind of finishing my book. I had been writing full time. I was only sort of writing a few hours a day because I became more interested in exploring all of these other things that were starting to sort of come to my awareness.
And I also, physics, that was the first thing I found too that gave me hope. Maybe there's something more. Is there one aspect of physics you might want to share with our listeners that influenced you, gave you some hope there could be more?
Well, and I just want to be really clear when I say this, that I don't subscribe to the idea that quantum physics has anything at all to do with consciousness or explaining non-physical reality. It is designed to explain our physical reality. So I just want to be careful of that, because I don't want to get into, I think it's really important that we don't get into pseudoscience, because it sort of undermines any credibility in everything. And so I feel like, in a way, we can be influenced and inspired, and things can trigger and inspire us to think in different ways. But I've never sort of gone to, oh, quantum physics proves anything other than what quantum physics attempts to prove itself in that field. But, things that did interest me were, the idea of non-locality, and the sort of the theories of non-locality, and because and there's a really interesting group in it was a really interesting group in Berkeley, California, a bunch of physicists that they call themselves the fundamental physics groups. And back in the 60s and 70s, they were doing acid. They were part of the whole hippie movement, and they actually ended up proving non-locality, which is basically, if there's a particle on this side of the universe and its twin is on the other side of the universe, if this particle spins one way, the other one instantaneously spins in the opposite way. And it was something that Einstein said was spooky action, couldn't exist. And John Bell in Northern Ireland actually came up with a theoretical model for this, that these hippie physicists many years later out in Berkeley, California, actually experimentally proved. And so I was always really interested in that idea of the twin particles. Now, I'm not saying it proves anything other than twin particles, but you know what I mean? It was just these things These were the things, people always talk about Schrodinger's cat, and they always talk about, the sort of observer effect and all that kind of stuff. But I found the spinning particles more interesting, to be honest, than the wave and form of the particles, those sorts of questions. But, and partly because, Berkeley, California is named after an Irish philosopher. Non-locality was proposed first by an Irish physicist. So there was just that sort of Irish connection to it there as well that added to the interest for me.
Yeah, I find that same thing fascinating too, because the information's transferring faster than the speed of light, which they
Mm.
say is not possible, and it's by a mechanism we don't understand. So, yeah, that
Mm.
was something that gave me a lot of hope early too.
Mm.
Did you always have some form of mediumship abilities that, like, did anything ever happen before the
Yeah,
passing of
I
Yamahan?
mean, yeah. When I was a child, I would wake up and see people at the end of the bed, and my mother would, as a child, would sort of notice me having conversations with somebody out that she couldn't see, that she would ask me who it is, who are you talking to? And I would say, oh, it's that man, or it's Nan Murphy, or whatever, which scared the life out of her because I was like 3 years old or something. Like, these people were all long dead, and so I had that as a child for sure. And but in my teens, I mean, who wants that in their teens? In your teens, you just you want to be a teenager, right? So when I got into my teens and into college, I was just more interested in just that, and music and going out and parties and clubs and whatever, and sitting around and being sort of pale and intellectual with poetry and, these sort of things that you want to do when you're a teenager. So no interest in this at all. And so it just sort of fell away. But, when I think back, I always had an intuition. Like, I could always tell if somebody wasn't. I mean, I remember one time just passing with my mother. We're just passing, walking out the door of a store and out into the street. I felt I would just pass somebody who's not all right. Hadn't even noticed this one, but we went back in. This woman was in a really bad way. She was just sort of standing there holding herself up, but I hadn't even noticed her. But it was just sort of, I had this feeling that something's not right there. And so I would have that sort of intuitive knowing, even after the people at the end of the bed stopped showing up. But yeah, so I've always had that sort of thing, but never paid much attention to it, I've got to be honest, until
Right.
my partner died. And then I was forced to pay attention to it.
Right. And I know from your book, it seemed like you were getting all these communication early on and you spoke to the priest, but you still were very on the fence about mediumship, afterlife. Was there a really strong pivotal sign or communication that you got that you were just, I know there were quite a few, but if you want to share one
Well,
and people
the
can,
one, the
yeah,
one that was the real clincher, it sort of ends the first part of the book, and I kind of feel like if I talk about that, then if anyone's reading the book, I'm going to ruin it on them. But there
right.
were, I mean, the thing is that the first thing to get your head around, the first thing I had to get my head around was that something survives death. So something, consciousness, therefore, cannot be an emergent property of the brain. So that was the first thing I had to get my head around. But that doesn't necessarily mean an individual consciousness still exists. It can, that's a bit of a leap, because it could just be that there's energy imprints. It could just be that there is some sort of, like the waveform. There is just some wave that all consciousness belongs to. It doesn't mean that a singular consciousness is arising from the wave of all consciousness. So the first thing that took me a while to understand was just that. It doesn't seem that consciousness dies with the brain, that it becomes part of something else. But then individuating that was another step, right? Because it had to be that I could recognize, actually really recognize. It wasn't enough to get signs, because I was like, well, that could just be in an infinite stream of consciousness and things arising from that. That doesn't mean there's actual individual consciousness creating these events, if you know what I mean. You know, it could just be part of the unending soup. So
Super psi versus mediumship. That's kind of that question. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so it became then, well, is this just energy imprints? Is this just some form of continuous stream of consciousness? Or is this an actual individual continuing to exist? So those two things are not automatic. Like one does not automatically lead to the other. And so that was, so then I started getting these very strong communications, very strong signs that eventually came to, there was one clincher, which is the one I don't want to give away because then it'll give away the whole, like,
I agree. Don't give that away. It was
where it was just like, oh, holy, I won't repeat the language I used. That was, I could actually see his distinctive personality, started to actually see his distinctive personality and what was going on. And I think it was all part of a process because I had to get to the point of just accepting consciousness as a non-emergent property of the brain first before I could get to accepting that individual consciousness continues in its individual form outside the body, discarnately. And the way that was, and I was thinking this, and obviously he knew I was thinking this because then all of the events that started happening started really looking and sounding distinctly like him. They weren't just random weird things happening, you know. And so that eventually the penny, there was one thing I won't spoil, that really made the penny drop, and that was like the holy moment, you know.
yeah.
And then that really skewed the path in another direction altogether. And as soon as I that clicked, then other people's discarnate relatives were showing up, sitting under a tree for picnic with somebody. So that started happening. You know, it was almost like, oh, now I understand it. I started, you know, being aware of other people's loved ones, and with the great delicacy, would sort of be sitting there with that person, looking at my friend or whoever I was with, going, should I tell them? You know, what should I tell them? Because you need to be very, very delicate about that. You can't just go, oh, hey, your dead gran is sitting here beside me. Because if people don't understand this, that could really freak them out, do a lot of harm. So much superstition around this could really scare people, really upset people, really cause them distress. So, you know, I was very, it took me a long time to sort of find, to see if it was appropriate or feasible to even broach these subjects with people. And more it started happening, and I was explaining to people, and eventually a number of people said, like, you really need to do something. Because I was just minding my own business. If somebody came along, I would talk. And eventually a few people said to me, like, you really need to do something with this because it's incredibly helpful to people. And so I was like, that's a big thing to step into other people's grief, you know, with this. And so I was like, if I'm going to do this, I really need to do it well. And so I started studying and training with tutors from the Arthur Findlay College in Britain, which is this amazing college for of mediumship. And it's all geared to a very, very, very high standard, and it comes out of the spiritualist tradition. So the one thing about the spiritualist tradition that I like is that it kind of arose from a sort of a scientific exploration of consciousness back in the late 1800s. So it still has that sort of ethos. So there's no superstition in it. There's no nonsense in it. It's very practical. And so that sort of appealed to me. So I started studying there. And I also studied grief and bereavement, did a certification in grief and bereavement counselling at the Institute of Counselling in Scotland. Now, I'm not a certified grief counsellor, but I just wanted to do the training to, because everybody's grief is different. My grief was my grief. That doesn't mean what I am experiencing, what's been comforting to me, is going to be comforting to you. And so there was a language I really wanted to learn, because I thought it's such a responsibility stepping into other people's grief, that if I'm going to do this, I am going to do this well. And so I spent a lot of time I mean, I was sort of doing bits and pieces, but I wasn't doing this like full time. I certainly wasn't doing it professionally at the time, but I did spend quite a number of years formally training this and understanding all of these other things that we're talking about. I'm a huge proponent of knowledge. You know, people, I hear this all the time from people, oh, are you a natural medium or a trained medium? And I'm like, both. Like, you know, people have this idea that if you have no training as a medium, if you just hop out of bed one morning and there it's all there and you start talking about it, that, oh, that's a natural medium. But that means that person had no education. no understanding of what's going on. Um, I feel all mediums need to be educated. So I'm a huge proponent of education, and the Dalai Lama talks about this all the time, that there has to be a balance between knowledge and practice. We can't have one without the other. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people just sort of running around. So, oh, I've got this and I've got that and I've got the other. And most of the time, they don't actually. Most of the time, they're just picking up psychic imprints from the person in front of them. They're not even connected to spirit. You can't tell you the amount of times I've had people say, oh, I've got your mother here and she's blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to my mother, are you talking to this person? Because it's just picking up imprints from, you can pick up, this is what people don't understand, is that a psychic can pick up 20 spot on solid facts about you, your loved one, your dad, your granny, whatever, your dog, anything, from reading you and picking that up from your energy and your memories without ever being connected to anybody in the spirit world. It takes an awful lot of training to understand, to recognize the subtle differences in that, you know. And
Right.
so there's an awful lot of people running around saying, "Oh, I've got your dad here," and and they don't at all. And then people buy it because, oh well, they knew he had a red car and they knew something else, and what they did was they picked that up from the person in front of them. So I'm a huge proponent of education and training, because we've got a huge, no therapist, no surgeon would be allowed to sit in front of a patient without having a huge amount of formal training. And yet, because this is an unregulated industry, people are running around doing this all the time, causing an inordinate amount of harm.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a few things I want to touch on with that. First of all, I know you said you do not refer to yourself at all as a psychic, and you just touched upon some of the differences. So you do pure mediumship, not ever reading psychically.
No.
And how can you tell the difference? Is it physiological? What is the personal experience for you in recognizing mediumship versus psychic?
So it's very difficult to explain. It's something you have to just learn and know. You just do it over and over again. So I would, when I was training, we would do all these practices where we'd work with the name of a living person and the name of a dead person, not know which was which. And you just work and work with work, and you'd be astonished how much information you can actually get from both. But at some point, there is a subtle difference in the energy of the feeling of it. And at some point, it stops just being facts and it starts being an emotional story. So anybody can give you a laundry list of facts. It doesn't prove anything. Right? But when you actually start, and it's something that has to be experienced on the part of the sitter as well, there comes a point in time where when you surrender to the wisdom and the power and the knowledge of the loved one and what they know they need to say, express, and convey, it has when you can get out of the way, just let that flow through you, it has an impact on the sitter where they actually start to feel a different sense of presence than when you're just rattling off a bunch of facts. Right. So I'm not of the school. There's an old way of teaching mediumship where it used to be you'd have a list of 10 questions and you had to get those details. You had to know the relationship, you had to know how they died, you had to know their parents, you'd have this list where you had to know what their job was, and you would start off, it was called the CERT method, and you would start off and you would just start interrogating these spirits. Now, the danger with that is that you can be picking that up from the aura, the energy field of the person in front of you. Right? And then what happened, I always say, why would your loved one make all of this effort to actually try to blend with the consciousness of this strange person who's is mediating a conversation with their loved one and just sit there and rattle off, well, I drove this car and I did this and I did this and I did this. If you had the opportunity, you would have something really heartfelt that you want to say. Now, you have to have details to prove who it is you're talking to. But once it is established who you're talking to, then you need to get out of the way, because the person in the spirit world will, if you think about it, you've had a whole life, say you've had 80 years. How much stuff would you have to talk about? So what you're going to choose
Lot.
to talk about is going to be stuff you choose to talk about because it's something your loved one needs to hear, right? And so when I'm teaching mediumship, it's a surrender to that. So you have to be very, very accurate with the details you get, because you can't start doing that until you know this whole thing of like, oh, I've got your dad here and he's always a lovely man. He was such a hardworking man and he loves you very much. Yeah, forget that. I mean, mentalists do that. They're not even doing. So there needs to be a standard of mediumship whereby we can, within the story we're telling, come up with these very, very concrete and solid facts that exist within the story. So it's not like you got to give 10 facts. Oh, now let me tell you some nice emotional story. Any writer knows the facts are built into the story. Does that make sense to you when I explain it like that? And so if you're
It
hearing a
does.
story, you'll feel the presence of your loved one more than you will feel, got your gran here, she had grey hair, she had rollers, she baked bread, and yeah, so did most people's grannies.
Right, right.
Mm.
Yeah, that could be cold reading if you're not getting really
Yeah.
specific evidence. Yeah.
It just takes an awful lot of training. It takes an awful lot of personal development. It takes a lot of, I mean, the thing that's really important in mediumship is that there needs to be an awful lot of healing and development on the part of the medium themselves, not just their mediumship, the medium. Because if you've got an ego, if you're sensitive, if you've got an ego and you're bringing that to you, the sitter can throw you off completely. You'll start finding, I've seen this, start feeling like they have to prove something to you. Now they're more interested in trying to prove something to you than they are actually giving an authentic voice to the loved one, right? And so we need to be able to do our own healing, to identify our own triggers, because all of our triggers will come up in mediumship. They'll all come up.
Right.
And so these things need to be healed within ourselves. And so I've seen so many mediums who aren't educated, aren't knowledgeable, passing around superstitions, don't even know where the origin of these thoughts come from. They're just passing them on without question. They haven't done their own healing. They haven't worked on their own triggers. And then they're just passing their issues onto very vulnerable people. So I am sometimes very frightened from people.
Yeah. And I know you touched upon this some in your book, and there's some experiences I would hear too. And I will also add, from my being more on the research end, I have seen zero scientific evidence of this. Zero. It's a very belief of some people, but I was told some people were like, "Oh, you shouldn't try to talk to your dad. You're keeping him locked here." I mean, and I know. Do you want to? And I've had some listeners reach out with concerns about things like that too. So, do you want to share anything about expand on some of the misconceptions and share some of your thoughts on that?
So that's a very, very long conversation, but I'll touch on a few things. So we have this notion that, if we don't do right by the dead, or if the dead has unfinished business in some way, that they can't rest and they will be wandering the earth as some kind of earthbound spirit, which basically comes from the Iliad. So that's a 2,000-year-old piece of fiction, right? Achilles had to properly bury Patroclus, or Patroclus couldn't rest. And so this has become 2,000 years later, this is the notion, but it comes from fiction. This was fiction to begin with. The Iliad is fiction to begin with, right? And so these are just these ideas. We've got these ideas of a lot of stuff coming from Dante, from the Divine Comedy. We're picking up an awful lot of stuff around that. We've got stuff that's still being passed on from, ancient tribal traditions, when people didn't even know that the earth was round. And still, we're still carrying belief systems like that with us. There's just no end to what these are. And I feel like we need to, in the 21st century, stop believing these old concepts of geography, for example, that this is the physical world and somehow we travel to some other geographical space. And what can happen between here and there is people can get lost. There is no geographical space in discarnate reality. We know this. We know this from consciousness theory. We know this from physics. Anytime we're beyond physical reality, there's no geography. If there was geography, it would be physical reality. Do you know what I mean? And so this idea that it's like, what, you people. And the other thing we know is that there's always a gathering. Know this without a doubt. Anytime somebody's dying, the loved ones in the spirit world always know there was always a gathering. I've given talks on this. They're on my website if anyone's interested. Um, there's always a gathering, and I have sat in the room with dying people and been aware of the gathering of people. I have no idea who they are, but the living family knew who they were when I told them. You know, there is always a gathering. Doesn't matter how fast the person goes. There's always a gathering. The spirit world knows, that those in spirit form know this in advance, and there was always a gathering there to be with the person as they are sifting out of carnate consciousness into discarnate consciousness. Now, I ask you, if people go to all of that trouble to gather, to help this person from one form into the other, how is it possible? What, do they just forget about them? Oh, sorry, we came all this way, now we forgot about you on our way back to wherever. I mean, this stuff is just lunacy. And so we really need to challenge these very archaic superstitions and myths and things that have arisen from medieval poetry, things that have arisen from tribal traditions, things that have arisen from classic Greek literature, and understand where they're originating from. Because if we were educated enough to know where these were originating from, we would be able to move past them.
Hey everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title. So the reason you know a lot of this and where it originates from is you have a PhD in ghost literature, right? And I'd love to hear more about that.
I'm a PhD candidate. It should be conferred by the end of this year, well, next month actually. But yeah, I got very interested in what's happening in things like spectrality and liminality in literature. There's an interesting sort of trend. I won't really call it a subgenre, but there's an interesting trend in American ghost literature in particular. I'm calling it ghost and spectrality just because that's the literary terms of the genre. This has not anything to do with defining ghosts, but where a lot of some contemporary Americans, the body of contemporary American authors have moved the ghost out of the physical world, right, into liminal. I'm calling it liminal space because the afterlife has all these connotations that have religious connotations. So this idea, is the ghost always, all ghost stories were, ghosts always haunting, right? So this is part of it. Ghost always haunts. This has become so embedded in our culture. You see a ghost, oh, it's disturbed, it's unsettled, it's haunting, right? And this is just because we've got this 2,000-year-old body of fiction that tells us that fiction. And so I got very interested in some trends in American ghost literature where the ghosts were being moved into these liminal spaces, discarnate liminal spaces, that were not either heaven or hell or purgatory or anywhere else, where they continue to exist and work through stuff and were actually haunted themselves more than haunting. Right? So the living doesn't even exist in these novels. And this is ranging from this broad range from like Man Booker Prize winner George Saunders' novel to Mitch Albom's New York Times bestseller novels to Alice Sebold's The Lovely Bones. This idea of spirits the consciousness just continuing, the issues continuing to be worked through in liminal space. It's only really been emerging that way in American literature of late. I mean, everybody loves a ghost story. Everybody's always writing ghost stories. And there are other interesting trends in ghost stories in other cultures. But the American culture I found fascinating. And then I came to, why is that? Why have these authors now all of a sudden just forgotten about, not bothered about the haunting, Dickens, anything else, and are exploring these very complex issues in very complex spaces? And so I got very interested in that. And so I spent the last 3.5, nearly 4 years researching that. And so, yeah, so that's been an interest. And so this is where a lot of reading and understanding came from, was, God, that's where that idea showed up from, you know.
Is there any fiction books or movies you think that got it the most accurate?
I think that so, you know, there's What Dreams May Come, Math's book What Dreams May Come. It's sort of an interesting. Now it's quite heavily. It's kind of got that syncretism of a sort of Buddhist beliefs plus Dante, because there's sort of River Styx idea in it, but then there's also this sort of Buddhist idea of reincarnation into it. So he's taken this sort of syncretism of beliefs, sort of blended them into this new way of looking, and so there's some interesting elements in What Dreams May Come. So that was a book and a movie. And then, you know, they did make a movie out of Alban's Five People You Meet in Heaven, which was sort of, now the movie version of it is quite different from the book version. So if anyone's interested, I'd say read the book. So there have been some books like that. There's also Clint Eastwood did that film, The Hereafter. Now the Hereafter is set here, not in the hereafter, but still sort of opened up some ideas, three different ways, three different storylines of looking at this in different ways, which was kind of, it was one woman had a near-death experience, one medium, and one kid whose brother died, and he was continuing to get communications from them. So it was a very nice, low-key, non-sensational way of sort of exploring some of these ideas, which I quite enjoyed as well.
I like that you said low key, because I feel like a lot of the stuff gets so over dramatized. You just can't take it seriously. At least I can't, you know.
Well, I think a lot of that comes down to sort of box office anxiety. You know, it's got to be horror because horror sells. And I think the reason why The Hereafter worked was because Clint Eastwood was directing it, you know, and it was a limited release, you know. So I think it just took somebody of his caliber to get something like that made, because otherwise we're just dealing with horror, you know.
Right. Which, yeah, I I don't relate to that. I think it's much scarier, the thought that consciousness is just neurons of a brain, and when we're extinguished, when it goes out, we're extinguished. So I don't find it the idea of an afterlife and, you know, non-local consciousness and, for lack of a better word, ghosts. I don't find that scary.
Yeah, there's an interesting body of work also that was done by Ernest Becker, who's a cultural anthropologist in the States here. And he wrote this book called The Denial of Death, which has been adapted into various different studies and people have used as research. And it basically shows how, actually, there's a documentary made about this with Gabriel Byrne narrating, and I can't remember what the documentary is called, but it's based on, it might be Flight from Death or something, but it's based on Becker's work, The Denial of Death. And what Becker did was he found that when you actually provoke people's fear of death, they become more violent, you know. And so, and it's
Okay.
really interesting. And if you don't have time to read the book is quite dense, but if you have time to at least read or watch the documentary, it's probably on Netflix or Amazon Prime or something. It shows you that in all of these experiments that were done, if they had one person and they made them very, very fearful of death, they turned very violent against other people. And so it almost really, well, it really speaks to the idea of that if we didn't have this morbid and mortal fear of death, that death anxiety, you know, would we be, if it provokes violent response from that anxiety, that survival instinct, which is very, very deep within us, if that didn't exist, would we be a more peaceful and a harmonious race?
Oh, I love that. And it makes sense, even if it probably gets a little distorted in how it manifests, but it makes sense if you think of just our evolutionary survival instincts. You know, if you're feeling a fear of death, if you're being chased by a tiger or, you know, a neighboring tribe, you know, from, you know, in caveman days, your survival instincts will go into violence because you have to fight for your survival. So it makes evolutionary sense, and then it probably gets very distorted in how it expresses itself in our culture. and world today. But um, now onto a completely, or back maybe more to our earlier topics. Have you gotten further signs since writing your book from your partner, from Johan?
So I don't really think of it in terms of signs anymore. I think I
Mm,
got signs at the beginning, which was more like a friend of mine called them like burning bushes, just trying to get my attention. So nobody obviously needs to do that anymore. So I am very much aware, but like since he died, lots of other people, my mother died, my father died, my aunt died, lots of other people have died. So I am aware of them, but in a much more subtle way, because they don't need to expend that kind of energy to get my attention that they did in the early days, because now I'm just aware when somebody's close. My mother speaks, so my mother will interrupt my thoughts. So I already always know when my mother is listening. Um, and
like you'll hear her voice in your head, in her voice, as if she's
phrases,
speaking.
just like she'll interrupt something, and I'll be thinking something, and she'll interrupt me, which is like typical of my mother. And I become aware of my dad just because the sort of emotional feeling I may have at a given time, will just sort of unexpected. I could be watching TV, and then suddenly I will feel sort of a feeling of calm come over me, and I know, oh, that's my dad. And sometimes I'm just very aware of who's present. Now, I just also just going to go back to what I said earlier, is it's not like somebody had to take a bus from some afterlife space to come hang out in my apartment. We are all, an analogy that I use that I've borrowed from Zen. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this, and a couple of other monks talk about this, is the idea of, and I find it a very useful way of explaining our connection, is that there is just the ocean, right? There is the ocean, and then there are waves, and the wave arises from the ocean, returns to the ocean. So is the wave the ocean? Or is so even if as waves are arising, there is still the ocean. So if we're all the waves, we're all still the ocean. And this is why I never really think in these sort of, oh, there's somebody in a body and then there's somebody in some other geographical location, and if we had a cosmic map we could find. There's none of this. I think we need to think more in terms of the waveforms and the waves of consciousness, and if we can akin that to the ocean, and we're all waves arising and returning to the ocean. Then it becomes, we start to understand that we are never, none of us ever separated from the other. So
Hmm.
if I was to think of my father and send a question out to my father, I just turn my awareness to my father, and there his thought will touch mine. It's that simple. We sort of run around making it like it's some big production. Even with mediumship, it's a big production. Oh, maybe will they be here? Will they not? Turn your awareness. Just gently move your focus there, and they will feel your thought touching theirs. And that's all there is to it. You know, and because if we start to recognize in this century, which we really should be moving beyond medieval thinking and into a sort of a way of thinking that is more reflective of contemporary understanding of consciousness and reality and energy and whatnot, then we begin to understand that all we're doing literally is turning our awareness. I say to my students sometimes, it's like being on the subway. If you're on the subway, you're minding your own business. It is very easy to turn your focus to listen in on the conversation beside you here. It is as equally easy to turn your focus in and listen to the conversation over there. That's all there is. Discarnate, incarnate. We know this is the illusion. We know that we exist. We know this is the illusion because we know 99 point what percent of us is empty space, and yet we think we are solid and full, right?
Right. Right. And we only see such a tiny portion of reality. I mean, already our brains are giving us illusions. I believe we don't see the center of things, and our brains fill in what would be in the center, and magicians are able to play with illusion once they understand neuroscience, which I just find that stuff so fascinating. And we're already just seeing a tiny portion of the color spectrum, and our brains are making up. I mean, our brains are sort of playing with light to create the experience of color anyway. It's not like color is an inherent thing. I mean, my brain can go on those tangents
Mm.
forever. But
It is, and it's a good point to bring up, Elizabeth, because because we can only understand what is within our own frame of reference. And so when we look at color, for example, if we were to show a color wheel to my cat, it would look very different to my cat than to me. And so, and especially if we showed a color wheel to my cat in the dark, he would see things very, very different from me. We can only understand what's within our frame of reference. And so all of these conversations, all of this consciousness is beyond the average person's experience. And so we can't, and I mean, I've had certain experiences that lots of other people haven't had, and other people have had experiences I haven't had. I think it's really important to remember that what we believe is based on what we can perceive. And anything we can't perceive, we cannot understand. And which is why you can't explain a color to somebody that doesn't exist on our color wheel, because it's beyond our frame of reference. And if we can't even comprehend a color that's not on our color wheel, how can we possibly comprehend the limitless potential of all that is?
Right, right. And apparently people have near-death experiences, see colors that don't exist on Earth. I mean, it's just things like that are so mind-blowing. And
I've seen colors in the hypnagogic state or in the dream state when I'm getting, when my partner particularly was communicating. He was an artist, so he's very good with imagery and color in his communications. And I have seen colors that I have recognized in the dream but could not describe to you.
that are not in our experience in Earth.
No. I have never
So,
seen it except in the dream, and I don't even know how to explain what the color is.
wow. And they're not even like a shade of one of our colors. It's as if there's a completely different base color.
Something else going on. It's almost like it's three-dimensional. It's very impossible to explain. Impossible, like I said, impossible to explain what's beyond our frame of reference.
So fascinating. And now I know you get, I guess, no longer science, but like a continued relationship with your loved ones, and you give other people medium readings. Is it a very different experience for you when you get mediumistic information from your loved ones versus when you're giving a reading?
So I never do readings, and I think it's really important that we don't call mediumship readings. And for the simple reason is that it's an unregulated field, and the responsibility is on the medium then to educate the public, right? So psychics do readings. And if we're trying to educate the public on the difference between psychism and mediumship, and we're calling mediumship readings, then what we're doing is confusing it. And then people can't tell the difference between psychics and mediums. And this is where a lot of harm gets done, because you've got a lot of psychics who think they're mediums. And what they're doing is just reading the aura of the person. Now, if you're a medium and you're having a conversation between, say, you and, say, your loved one, so now I'm mediating a conversation. What am I reading? If I was sitting down to dinner with two people on their feet, am I reading them? We're just having a three-way conversation, So I think it's really important that we understand that mediumship is not reading. And I know at the college, at the Arthur Findlay College, it's called, either you're doing a demonstration of mediumship, say in a church service, in which case you are giving messages for a recipient, or you're doing a private sitting, because you're sitting with the spirit, which is really important. It's very important to me. I do know some people, I know a couple of people who work as psychics doing psychic readings, and also as mediums doing mediumship sittings. They don't call themselves psychic mediums, they call themselves psychics and mediums, which I think is a nice compromise for that. I'm a psychic and I'm a medium, because it shows that there's a differentiation between them. And that's very important, because when we don't understand that differentiation, we have people going to psychics, and psychics are giving them, I mean, we've all seen this on TV. We've all seen this everywhere. Absolutely horrendous things going on because people don't understand the difference. And so there is no great body there. Well, I mean, the college in England does, but it's not like it's an official, it's not like it's the American Medical Association, you know what I mean? But I feel like it's very important that we differentiate that, because I've had people come to me and they've been, and I can tell the minute they sit in front of me, they've been to 30 psychics, and it makes it next to impossible to work with them because they're like, can you tell me what's in my hand? Why would I want to do that? Well,
That
because if my wife was really there, she's going to tell you what's in my hand. Well, you know what? That's called psychometry, and a psychic can do that. That's not any proof that the wife is there. The only proof that the wife was there, well, first of all, we can't actually prove anything beyond. Yeah, what we can do is present information that would suggest beyond a reasonable doubt this is the person. Some people are impossible to convince. Doesn't matter if you gave the person's social security number, they still wouldn't believe it. And some people are desperate to believe they'll believe anything, and they're the people I fear for, because they'll believe anything because there's such a state of grief, you know. Um,
right.
and so I think it's very important. So if somebody comes along to me asking me to do things that a psychic could do, I just say, no, go see a psychic. If you want to communicate with your loved one, we are going to work with your loved one in such a way that the whole objective here is to allow them share a story with specific details that you recognize within that story so that you and they can feel their presence. Because that's something a psychic cannot do, you know.
Right.
So, sorry to go off on that tangent, but this is why I don't use the word psychic and I never use the word readings.
No, that's really good to know. This is actually the first time I heard that. So I think that's good for our listeners to hear. And yeah, I mean, even neuroscience, the ones that are open to this and studying it have found different brainwave patterns in psychic readings versus medium readings for, people that do both. I found that fascinating.
Well, they're
Yeah.
very different things. Now, having said that, all mediums have psychic abilities because we need to use clairsentience, clairvoyance, clairvoyance. We need to use those senses to receive telepathic information. This is how they're used. But I know some fabulous mediums who are terrible psychics. They could sit in front of you and they're terrible doing that kind of work, and they're great mediums, and vice versa. So these things are not synonymous.
And then do you think physics is going to end up proving there is survival of consciousness, continuation of consciousness?
So I think we need to be really careful about what tools we're using to measure what. So I don't really feel that physics in its current incarnation, and that's not to say there's not going to be a new school of mediumship down the road. I mean, quantum is very different from classical, you know, so that's not to say, but I don't feel the physics we currently have is the right tool for measuring consciousness. So I feel like either a different branch of psychology or philosophy will probably, and that's where, for example, Chalmers is working. That may find different ways of understanding or comprehending the nature of consciousness. But I feel that physics, classical or quantum, those are not. I don't feel that they are the tools or the models that can be applied to this. But like I said, that's not to say that at some point there's not going to be some whole new school of physics that discovers something new. I just don't feel currently what we're dealing with speaks that language.
Do you have any vision of what that could look like? Would it be like some super advanced Large Hadron Collider that can measure the other non-physical particle of consciousness? Or I have so many like random, probably totally wrong theories.
Well, that would imply that discarnate beings have particles, right? So we don't know what we're measuring, right? That's the thing. So yeah, a collider can measure a bunch of particles, but if there is no particles, what's it measuring? So I don't. I feel like we're easily a century or two away from actually being able to measure what's going on. I don't think it's anything that's within. Well, first of all, it's almost like academic suicide to start getting involved in this. I mean, if we look at people I know you like Roger Penrose and Rupert Sheldrake, I mean, very very established people before they started talking in these ways. But this is like career suicide for these people to start talking about this sort of stuff. So it's not something. I mean, even in academia, I mean, even in ghost literature. There was really nothing being done on this since I think 72 or earlier. Like it was just almost within academia. If you start looking at ghost literature, spectral literature, anything like this, it was like asking, it was like academic suicide. So, these are not subjects that are generally taken seriously. And so it takes a
Mhm.
very brave soul and a very established, respected, brave soul to start looking in these ways. Because the first thing that's going to happen is ridicule.
Right. Even established ones, I believe. I think I have this right, but I believe Dr. Brian Josephson, they tried to ban him from one of the talks on physics or one of the scientific conferences. I mean, he's pretty established, and luckily people band together, other speakers band together and said that was not okay. But I mean, they start getting banned multiple places.
Yeah, just give me because there's somebody else to give a TED talk that was pulled.
That was Rupert Sheldrake.
Sheldrake. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Sheldrake's talk was actually pulled. But it's you start finding that even with Russell Targ, who was part of the CIA Stargate program. I mean, that's just the nature of what we're dealing with. So if we're still at that stage, if we're still at the stage where we're believing stuff from ancient Greece and the Reformation, the Middle Ages, and Dante from medieval, but if we're still believing that superstition, and if we're still I really feel that we are moving, and this is what I wrote about in my doctorate, we're moving into a post-secular age, but we're still very much caught in that Enlightenment whirlpool where secularization is all that is. And, I find, and I'm sure you've seen this too, where people go, if they're trying to prove something, they go, well, scientists say. So what? It's almost like,
I'm guilty of that myself. Yeah.
oh, the scientists say, therefore, well, who cares? The scientists are not God. Or sort of looking to the scientists saying, oh, if the scientists say it must be true. That's not who's, yeah, the scientists have the stuff they say about science isn't true. So, but this is just the age we're in. Oh, scientists say. So if we're still in that sort of secularization thesis, I feel like we're on this cusp of post-secularism at the moment, but it's very ill-defined and it's very, very new. And where we're starting to see that the secularization thesis that there is not an omnipotent being controlling the universe is failing. When we start to look at it within the social fabric of society, we're starting to see an epidemic of loneliness. We're starting to see an epidemic of meaninglessness, of this sort of being lost in this cold and caring cosmos. And that's starting slowly to change. But I think we're a very, very long way away from people even getting to the point where you can start asking questions about this in an academic field, in the field of psychology or science or anything else, where you can actually be taken seriously when you start asking these questions. So we're a long way even away from that. So we can't even ask the questions yet. We are certainly a long way from finding answers.
You mentioned an omnipotent being. Do you think there is one being, a form of a god, or do you think it's just that our consciousness, the root of it is non-local, and in whatever way that works, and there isn't a being above us having anything to do with that? Or
Well, I believe in the ocean. I believe in the wave, right? I have um, read and had experiences with people who done quite a lot of work on this. I know there's a place in New York, or the place I think around Portugal or Brazil, called the International Academy of Science, who really endeavour to get rid of all these terms like the aura and get rid of all of these terms that have all this baggage with them and create this whole new language around it. We know from people like even Swedenborg back in the 1700s, and that there seems to be an advancement towards something. But what that something is never really been defined. And even in the literature that I was talking about, it's all starting to talk about that. They arrive in first heaven, then they do certain things. There is a second heaven, there is the bardo, and then there's something beyond the bardo. There is, in all of these novels, there is this, then there's the first thing, then there's another one. It almost becomes like there's just this tier of liminal spaces we keep advancing through. Where that ends up, who knows? I know they say things like the 10th dimension or the 11th dimension, but then this is
Yeah.
just hypotheses. This is just somebody's idea. Nobody knows how many dimensions there are. I mean, string theory is talking about what? How many theories? 11 theories in string theory.
I think 11. I think there's, I might have this wrong. I believe one of the theories says there's 9 and one version of it says there's 11. I know there's two theories with two different.
I think string theory is 10, and then M theory, I think, is 11. And
Maybe that's,
and so, but that's just talking about dimensional space. That's not talking about omnipotence. I mean, again, these are different languages, so I think we really need to be very careful. I hear so much pseudoscience, and it just makes us look stupid. Brian
right.
Cox, the British physicist. I saw a talk he gave at, I think it was the Royal Albert Hall, which is like Madison Square Garden, is massive. And he came out, and the first thing he said was something along the lines of, quantum physics does not in any way lend itself to psychic nonsense. And the whole of the Royal Albert Hall burst out laughing. And this is the thing. The minute we start trying to we can use this language to inspire new thinking, but we cannot use the language of an apple to explain an orange. I think it's very careful. We have to be very careful about that. Otherwise, it just becomes pseudoscientific nonsense that nobody's taking seriously. And if we're trying to be taken seriously, we need to find our own language.
Yeah. I liked what you said at the start about physics, that it just explains that there's something that we don't understand going on. And I would say I think that's a problem, is people see things. And you can say I'm stepping out now into philosophy and speculating, it could say this and draw conclusions in that sense and say, I don't know, this is now philosophy. But I have seen that as something that I do think hurts this research a lot, is that people, instead of just saying this is philosophy, this is interesting, maybe it could mean that, they take a bunch of words, for lack of a, I know some people find this offensive to say, but very woo words, and then say they absolutely draw this conclusion that, like, one speculation I have is that whatever mechanism between two particles in quantum entanglement is going to be the same family of mechanism for survival of consciousness in that communication. I could be totally wrong, but then I think people jump way too much and then saying this
Yeah,
proves instead of this could maybe make this think, So I think that is something that makes this research sadly a bit of a joke with
yeah,
people when it's really
yeah.
not. It's
Yeah, it's very different to say, well, that sort of dynamic could suggest something along these lines. It's a very different thing from saying that proves something, which it doesn't do.
yeah.
Proof is a
Yeah.
very hefty thing. I mean, the Darwin's theory of evolution is not actually proven because it can't be proved, because it can't meet scientific requirements for proof. So this is why it's still called theory, but it's accepted
Yeah.
theory. But the burden of proof in science is a hefty, very hefty, tall order. So it's not a word to be bandied about lightly.
Right. And often when things are proven, we advance further and find out it's still wrong, or
Yeah,
there's other layers to it, or
exactly. There's more to it. Yeah, always more to it. Yeah.
um so, and I guess I'll ask you a little bit. I was going to ask if you're convinced there's an afterlife now, but it sounds like pretty much you are. Survival of consciousness. I also don't love the word afterlife because it implies you're here, then there, and that's the only two states of consciousness, and that's it. You live one life and then you're in an afterlife, and it applies too much time constraint to it. But I guess I'll ask then, do you think this consciousness, sometimes in material world and sometimes non-physical, do you think this continues eternally, or do you think maybe we go to this non-physical state, come here again a few times, and then it all fizzles out, and in like a trillion years our consciousness completely fizzles out? I know that's speculative. I don't expect a concrete answer, but what would you speculate about that?
Well, from what I know from, sort of the IAC and from other people's experiences, and just from my own sort of experiences as well, is that there does seem to be a multi-dimensional space of which we are a dimension of a continuum of multi-dimensional spaces. So there's no real clear delineation between this space and another. As a practicing Buddhist, people sort of say, oh, you believe in reincarnation. But there's a big difference between Western Buddhism and Western concepts of reincarnation and Eastern concepts of reincarnation. Because in the East, Buddhism is based on the concept of no self. So if there is no self, what is reincarnating? And I always say this, like, if you take away your culture, if you take away your gender, if you take away your memories, if you take away every experience of your upbringing, if you take away your language, take away all your memories, I think I said that, what is left?
Oof. I hate that idea. I absolutely hate that idea. I like being me. I like my loved ones being them.
Yeah, we have this idea that, oh, we die and then I'm back. But if I don't have the memories, the culture, the language, the upbringing, the influences, the gender, the genome, which you don't have, which you wouldn't have, what is reincarnating?
I don't know. I just go on reincarnation based on the research of Dr. Jim Tucker and Dr. Ian Stevenson. I'd have no other reasons to think it's works or that it is. Or I also go to it as the last resort if consciousness is created by a brain, which to me is the worst option, but if it's true, it's true. I don't think it's the most likely option, but I can't rule it out.
Mm.
Then I do think reincarnation is essentially definite, but not in the way people perceive it. It's just if you think of the concept of eternity, eternal big bangs, big crunches, the amount of Goldilocks planets in the multiple universes, in the multiple galaxies, possibly multiverses, the and I would assume, I think I said eternal big bangs, big crunches with growths of other universes. There's no way that other forms of complex intelligent life isn't on multiple planets and won't continue eternally. It seems impossible that another set of brain neurons won't create another consciousness that you get to experience as a you. Not the same person, not with karma, but that's better than eternally never experiencing consciousness again. So that's it. Reincarnation, I'd say, goes to that was after physics, that was the very first thing that gave me hope there could be survival of consciousness. Then I found Dr. Jim Tucker. I mean, my listeners know that story. I don't need to bore them with that. But it's always my default that if consciousness ends up created by a brain, at least there'll be experiences I get to experience again. But I don't know. I just think reincarnation, I just go by Dr. Jim Tucker and Dr. Ian Stevenson. If consciousness is
Yeah,
non-physical,
but
it
we got
seems
to
like
remember,
you can't explain their research in any other way.
but you got to remember, Ian Stevenson called his book 12 Cases suggestive. He didn't say this proves reincarnation. He just said it was suggestive. The other thing too is there's what, 8 billion people on the planet, and he's got 12 cases. So I think we've got to keep this in perspective. The other thing too, and this is completely speculative, is that I communicate with people's loved ones all the time in the afterlife, and in the afterlife, in wherever discarnate form, and they share their memories with me, and those memories are vivid, and I experience those memories with them, and then I share them with the loved ones. And so I've often wondered, when people come back with certain memories of a previous life, are they theirs, or are they somebody else's that they're picked up and they're sharing? Like, I know that's as not as plausible, but it's still not implausible. And then people say, oh, well, yeah,
Yeah.
but there's scars. We've got scars from this and the other, you know what I mean? But the thing I'm saying is that Ian Stevenson named his book Suggestive. And then Ian Stevenson wrote a second book, because those cases were all in the East, right? They were Eastern cases. And his second book was much more, in the West, was much more anecdotal, because it was being written in a culture where people don't have the same beliefs in reincarnation that they did in the East. For me, I actually think my sense is, and of course there's no proof for any of this,
Of
is that
course.
we simultaneously exist in multidimensional spaces. You know,
That's
because if you
fascinating.
had to reconcile mediumship with reincarnation, people say, well, how many generations can you go back? Well, the furthest I've gone back is 4, but then how can you go back much more than, how much can somebody remember much more than that? Now, in some of the indigenous tribes, they believe that we exist for eight generations before. But does that mean 8 generations in what? First heaven, second heaven, whatever name,
Mhm.
no idea. If we are existing in multi-dimensional space, then we are the ocean and the waves simultaneously. And that would explain why some people seem to be reincarnated. I mean, if somebody, I've had, and this is no joke, I had somebody come sit in front of me and say, it was at the Education Centre in New York, and he had come in, popped in. I was sitting there in a room, and I was doing some sittings for people, and this is a long time ago. And he came in, and and I said, "Well, come on, sit down, and we'll do." And he said, "Yeah, no, I'd love to talk to my father, but." Apparently, he's reincarnated. He's reincarnated because some medium told me, "Haven't no, your father's no, you can't read your father because your father's reincarnated."
Which is an awful thing to say to someone in deep grief. First of all, I mean, yeah, that's horrible.
What it actually means is the medium wasn't able to connect with the father, or the medium wasn't a medium. And so there, because mediums can say anything, because people believe mediums have a power greater than them, which is why we need to be so ethical and morally responsible about this. So I said, "Well, sit down, we'll see." And the minute he sat down, I was sitting there with the man. I started playing, and I had this little thing of mala beads. And I was saying, "Well, I've got a man here who looks like this, and he's fiddling with these mala beads with this bead on the end of it." So, "Yeah, that was my dad's mala beads." I mean, I'm not joking you. Within seconds, his father was sitting there with us with his mala beads that he always played with. But somebody had told this guy his father was reincarnated, and so we
Mhm.
need to be careful with that. But the other thing too is that if we exist simultaneously in multiple spaces, because we have this very pedantic linear way of thinking, blah, 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 right? But if we
Right,
simultaneously exist in multi-dimensional space, then we are the ocean and the wave. Then we are there in discarnate form, in spirit form, as we speak, right? And also in incarnate consciousness. Which is why if this can happen, then somebody could come along and say, "Oh, my great grandmother's reincarnated," but then I can still communicate with her. So why is she being 4 generations there and somebody else hasn't?
right,
We have to,
right.
we have to challenge our very pedantic, sort of meat and potatoes way of thinking about these things, you know.
Yeah,
Because it would be an explanation for why, say, somebody's 4-year-old son can remember being killed in a previous life in India somewhere, and yet some medium somewhere else can communicate with them. It's because our consciousness is existing in multidimensional liminal spaces. We're not just in this body and then we die and then we're somewhere else. We are, and which makes sense when we understand that consciousness is not an emergent property of the brain. If it's not an emergent property of the brain, it doesn't exist within the brain. It exists somewhere else.
right.
Even when we're
Yeah,
in our bodies, it's existing somewhere else. And we think, and because we think with our brain, we think that's where it is.
I kind of tend to think that too. My image of it is like a quantum cloud, and it's quantum entangling for it's the best word I have. It's probably not exactly like physicists would probably not be happy I'm using that word, but it's the best explanation. Downloading and quantum entangling with multiple physical beings, most likely in different dimensions. And I can't go past all the times of multiple lives in this dimension. I don't think I think that gets into. I just can't make a picture of that because I think our brains are built in a way where we cannot experience or perceive time any other way than linearly. It's just we can't do it. We can read about it. We can read Einstein's theory of time relativity. We can draw a picture that all these lives are going on simultaneously. But I mean, for all we know, I'm experiencing today right now, and in like tomorrow I'll wake up and I'm 80, and then I'll be 5. Like we don't, and it's all sort of coming together for this brain experience. I mean, if that was going on, we would have no idea. We
Right.
wouldn't know. But it's impossible as a human to picture that in an experiential way any more than we can picture a color we don't know. But near death experiencers will say it's actually time is much more just our brain attuned to experiencing something that's not real. I find that I can't understand that.
Well, we can't even understand uh, no time. We can't understand that. I mean, animals can. They don't perceive time like us, but we can't perceive the absence of time. Never mind multi-dimensional time. We can't even perceive
Mhm.
the absence of time because this is what we're bound to.
I don't even know what that means. Like, I can read about it. Yeah. The concept of no time seems impossible because even if you're in a meditative state of experiencing no time, you still, if you go into that meditative state at 4 p.m., you come out of it at 6 at a certain time of year, it's dark. Your cells have aged. I mean, mildly, 2 hours, but it's true. Your body has changed. You might have gone in full and you come out of it hungry.
Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah.
I think that the thing I know it's interesting to sort of posit and sort of spin on all of these things. But for me, as a medium, like people always come to me saying, "Oh, has your partner told you what the afterlife is like?" And I'm like, it wouldn't matter if you tried because I wouldn't have a frame of reference to understand it. At least I don't have any recall of being in discarnate form to understand that. I mean, I've certainly had out of body experiences, and I'm always wary also of out of body experiences and near death experience because I think you cannot remove the element of perception out of these experiences. Which is why Hindus rarely meet Jesus at the gate and Christians rarely meet Krishna at the gate. Like and I'm not saying either is wrong. What I'm saying is that we have to factor in that we cannot see, and the philosopher's been talking about this for eons. Kant was talking about this. We cannot see and understand beyond our own perception, right? And so if we die and expect something to happen, that's what we will perceive in malleable space. Right?
That's why I'm very interested in the veridical NDEs, or people, sometimes you'll have a fundamentalist religious Christian going in and they're shocked because they don't see any Christian symbology, and they'll see people who've passed away, or the Pekindarian, where they'll see people who they know have passed away, and then they're shocked to see this other young, healthy person, and then they find out that person passed during that time frame in an unexpected accident. So those are the stuff you have to, yeah, you cannot draw a final conclusion, but I think it's all, I always say preponderance of evidence of survival.
Well, I think that for me, the bigger question is not what's the afterlife about, or what's the afterlife like, or what's the nature of all this. It's all very nice and interesting to discuss these and posit these and theorize about these. But when people ask me these questions about, oh, did anyone tell you what the afterlife is like? I always think, if I was supposed to know what the afterlife was like, I would be there, I'm sure. Or I would never have left there, I'm sure, or whatever space that was. That if we are here for a reason, if we are here by some choice, then it is for a reason we are here. And so for me, it becomes more about the focus of why are we here more than what's all that about? Because we're going to die and find out anyway.
Right.
And so, but why did we choose to be here? That's to me the very unsexy but truth of all of it is like, why did we choose? If we exist in multiple multidimensional space, why did we choose to pop into this body in this time in this space to this family to this culture?
Right.
What was for? So to me, the lesson is not what's out there running around. The lesson is, what did I choose to come here to learn? That's the more important question to me as a medium.
Right.
What is the point of being here? Because here we have the challenges that we wouldn't have in discarnate space. We have the Becker findings, we have violence, we have cruelty, we have survival instinct, we have the genome, we have illness and disease, we have all of these things. How do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile the problem of evil? How do we reconcile all these? So why, I always think, if I was not supposed to be here to learn something, I wouldn't have come.
Right. That's a good way. Yeah. I mean, I've started to think about that some more. I mean, I used to think it was just a physiological accident, but when you add this whole other layers and a purpose, I think it makes it more. Oh, hello. I've got one too. Who's that?
This is Tara.
Hi, Tara. For those just listening on audio, this was a very cute black cat just popped up. Little cute one. Yeah, I think once you get to the point where there's enough evidence to think there's non-physical dimensions and that there's more than just an accident brain neurons making you here, those are very good questions to ask, because I think once you get that premise, it can't just be an accident anymore. if
Yeah.
it's more than Darwinian, you know.
Yeah. I
I,
mean, it just seems there's two. And the thing I also find interesting, I kind of find in a weird way the not, I mean, because I've always been very, very heady and I have learned over the last years to be much more experiential, which is where I think I'm kind of rounding back to Buddhism, is that, is to actually just enjoy the not knowing, to enjoy the experiences that arise from not knowing. Because the minute we bring the brain into it, it's going to try to rationalize something it can't possibly rationalize, and it's going to limit it and box it to try to fit it into a frame of reference it doesn't belong in. And if we can stay out of that box, the experience becomes much more mystical. We become much more open to whole other levels of experience that we wouldn't know if the brain's trying to drive the bus. But I do think that this is a very challenging place to be, this physical dimension. And so, why are we here? It's not about where are we going. We're going to get there. Well, why did we choose to be here, and what can we do and learn while we're here that we cannot do when we leave? And that, to me, is the question.
right. And it keeps, yeah. I tend to get way too heady. And anytime I try to have experiences like out of body, I think I get close and I start analyzing. So that's a good thing, I think, to work on for all of us listening too, and to enjoy the experience of being here too, which sometimes can be hard. Sometimes you're like, it's so hard. We're so in grief. It's so sad. But yeah, I think there's a
It's kind of
purpose.
what is called the beginner's mind. If we can approach all of these things with the beginner's mind, with that sort of humility that we don't know, then we approach everything with this sort of openness and curiosity and that magic that kids have, right?
Right.
Wow,
Right.
oh my God, that's amazing. That's fantastic. I mean, the fact, being open like that, I've had some really interesting experience that are very, very hard to articulate with my partner, which if the mind was in there trying to rationalize it, which is it's not going to do, all it's going to do is limit the profundity of the experience. Then you can just sort of, it's like going on a roller coaster ride. It's just so exciting and so mystical and so magical and all these words that we can't use it within the scientific paradigm, but they don't belong in that paradigm. And I really think that the biggest challenge in this incarnation is to care about each other, and it's that simple. I
That's
mean, if we're
that's
all part of the same continuous ocean wave, dimensional space, whatever you want to call it, and we're out there killing each other, what is going on? Like, so this is where I kind of feel, we will eventually evolve beyond these instincts that we currently have.
the killing each other and in this iteration of the planet, you think?
Yeah,
You
just
think we will in
anything
time?
that's divisive, anything that is separates us, anything that's divisive that leads to these things. Because the state of the planet, I mean, there's a whole other conversation, but the state of the planet has come from this feeling that we need to grow, we need to kill, we need to eat, we need to survive. And the incredibly short-sighted part of that is when the planet dies, we die, and we'll die before it. you
Right.
but the
Right.
instinct is so strong that the brain is not even. And then what happens is like, oh, well, they're doing it over there. If they do it over there and I'm being really good over here, I'll starve to death and they'll do okay. And then it becomes, oh, I'm going to do it there. I'm not, it's a really primitive, very instinctual way of thinking. And I feel like our purpose for being here is to work our way towards overcoming that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I can see that. And getting to, I mean, they say the purpose is love. That's what all NDEers come back saying. And then people who study this start to say that. And what would you say is the biggest what the fuck you've encountered, if there is one?
Well, I mean, the one that's really not sexy is that what are we doing to each other? And, why, when we understand compassion, we understand kindness, We know that people respond to positivity. We know that people respond to kindness. All you have to do is look at, even on social media, the likes for cute movies or little reels of people helping each other. We are starved for this, right? You ever notice that? Starved for it. How much people love to see little videos of somebody helping somebody else, right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
naturally want to go there. That's where we naturally want to be, in that state of kindness and compassion and connection and support. And so the biggest what the fuck for me is, what's the rest of this crap? And how do we overcome the rest of this crap when our natural propensity is towards kindness and goodness? So I know that's not very sort of, oh, some kind of mystical experience stuff, but that really, and I'm guilty of it too. We can't sit around sort of being holier than thou, because we're all guilty of it. We're all guilty of it. And it's something that we really need to overcome, because if we didn't have a physical form, we wouldn't have that instinct to have to try to overcome. We'd be just sort of probably sitting up playing harps on clouds someplace. Do you know what I mean? So that's
Mm.
one thing that I constantly come back to. And all you have to look at, everybody, we can sit around to be holier than that. But I've been through earthquakes. I've been in war. I was here for September 11th, and I've seen how people respond in that instinctual response when it looks like you're going to die. Everything goes out the window. And that,
Right.
like, how do we evolve beyond that? That's why being aware of this bigger picture sort of removes that Ernest Becker fear of denial of death sort of idea, to be able to see beyond that, to see now, how can we really grow and evolve here? It's very, 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 very difficult on the planet to do that. I would say, in terms of continued existence, and this hasn't been my own personal experience necessarily, but I've had lots of little experiences, like out of body experiences, and suddenly going, oh, this is fantastic. I'm out of my body. I can like float out of the apartment and float over the city. And then kind of got up and got stuck in the ceiling. Why? Because the mind went, oh, this is solid. I can't get through it, right? Stupid things like that. This is why I'm not a fan of trying to rationalize, because it always gets us stuck. But is a story I heard from the IAC, where the founder, and I don't know, can't remember all of the details, it's a long, long time since I've heard this story, but the founder used to have these out of body experiences for many, 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 many years. And each,
Was this Nancy or Wagner or?
no, the
Mm.
IAC is a Portuguese, I think he was either Brazilian or
Yeah.
Portuguese.
International Academy of Consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Weren't the founders Nancy and Wagner? Maybe there's someone before them
It
I'm thinking
wasn't a
of.
woman. This was definitely a man. I thought his name was Paul or something. I can't remember his name. But he tells the story anyway of how over the many, many, many years he would get to higher and higher dimensional spaces, right? And meet higher, more and more evolved beings, which is this very Swedenborgian as well. And they tell this story of how one day he's with this very, very advanced being, and he asks some great big question of like, well, what is the meaning of life, or what's the nature of reality, or something like that, right? Some big, huge, unanswerable question. And the being says, like, I can't explain it to you because you haven't the capacity to understand it, right? And so he says, no, I'm really smart, I'm really open-minded, I've had all these experiences, just tell me, I can comprehend it. And in a split second, he said, he got this massive download, such that he didn't know if he had been shown a mathematical equation or heard a piece of music or saw some image. Like, it was so beyond comprehension that not only could he not understand what he received, he couldn't even understand how he received it. And it came in this split second. So it's back to what we were saying about time. It's, this idea that everything exists in this tiny speck. And so to me, I've always stayed with me, that story, because it just really, this is where I think there's great mystery and magic. I get really excited. There is so much there that we cannot possibly understand. That if we can just go with the experience of it, then we can have a lived experience. But if we try to reason it, we're going to be like the guy saying, wait, was that equation or music or whatever? We cannot understand. And I find actually that kind of exciting, because it just means how much more we have to look forward to. And in terms of people who are grieving, how much their loved ones are exploring stuff that we cannot even possibly understand. That they're in this playground now, exploring and learning and seeing all this stuff that they could not understand in this form. They're looking at us. I always feel like they're looking at us and trying to communicate with us like we're Jersey cows. We're just lumbering around. And the speed, and you can feel the speed of the energy moving and the speed of the thoughts moving. It's like such a fascinating space that I think that opens this door to so much magic mysticism that we have to look forward to.
Oh, I think that's a beautiful way to end. And now, lastly, where can our listeners find you? Remind them the name of your books, tell them your website, and
So my book is Till Death Don't Us Part. This is my last book. My other book was a political book. This is my last book. And my website is karenfrancesmccarthy.com. So that's Frances with an E. And actually, on that, if you're interested, we have a free spirits-based community where there's loads of talks that I've given, and guided meditations, things for helping practice. There's loads and loads of free stuff there. Recommended reading, which I really need to update probably over Christmas when I get a chance. But just put an awful lot of resources there to try to help people who are interested in knowledge and wisdom and education, to give people some space to actually start to explore these things that you and I are talking about, who don't want to just take the superstition that somebody told them or the myth, whatever, and they actually want to go and try to find something that has more depth and to it, and is definitely more inspiring. So there's a range of recommended reading there as well for them. So KarenFrancesMcCarthy.com.
great. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, it's my pleasure. I've enjoyed chatting with you.
Hi, everyone. So, major exciting news. Book number 1, WTF Just Happened. A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife, is now available in audiobook. You can get it through my website or on Apple Books and on Audible. I read it myself, which was a really intense learning experience, as well as emotional, as I relived a lot of memories. But for those of you who want to hear even more of my voice for some reason, or also are like me and prefer audiobooks, you can now listen to it. And what's also fun is some of the people read themselves. So you can go to my website, WTFJustHappened.net, where I link to Audible and Apple Books, or you can go directly to Amazon to get it on Audible, or Apple Books to get it there. And I hope you enjoy it. And as always, let me know any feedback. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists, trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just just_happened_, or email me at hello@wtfjusthappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?